me, but if it doesn't, I'd like to ask if you would try if it stops recording, just as a flag. I have it recording, but it may stop and say I don't have enough space, but I just want to
Gotcha.
ask.
It says it's recording on my screen, so.
Okay, great. Thank you again, Stan, for having me out, and really just encouraged and excited to be just kind of co-conspirators in this much needed series with North Carolina Black Alliance and the movement that the Triangle Iotas are doing and leading for our community, and just really excited, as well as a partnership with Sigma Gamma Rho and just others. So thank you for just having me here and really talking about, you know, as you said, gerrymandering is not considered a sexy topic. And so the word alone, and I think it's very purposeful that gerrymandering sounds as just as boring as you know, as we perceive it to be, but really it is much more dangerous, much more violent, much more exciting and enthralling than politics and would let on. And so we're going to talk about, and I'm going to share my slides. And so Stan, let me know if you can't see my screen. And so what we're going to go through today is following this, I will send my slides to Stan because it is a lot of information that I encourage folks to study, to meditate, to ruminate over it, because you will start to see gerrymandering and redistricting. You'll start to see it pop up in ways that you haven't even imagined. Like you'll start to see it in food deserts. You'll start to see it in zoning maps if you don't already, right? There's so many ways that redistricting actually rules our entire lives and just our processes. It is voting, but it's so much in addition to voting, which is why our vote is as powerful or as diluted as it is. It all boils down to redistricting. And so let me actually share my screen. And like I said, let me know, Stan, if you cannot see my screen.
And I can see your screen.
Okay, wonderful.
Well, I thought I did.
Okay, there we go.
There we go.
Okay, great. So what I like to do, definitely as folks have questions, I want to make sure that this is a holistic approach. I'm an educator at heart. I have taught in all levels of school, including being a former homeschooler in my adolescence, but definitely have taught as an educator in charter, public, private, so forth. And so it's definitely a passion to be able to educate. So if there are questions that I need to expound and back up, let me know once I get through the slides, and I can most definitely do that to kind of break down whatever I need to. And so how it all connects. Redistricting is what we're talking about. Gerrymandering is what we're talking about. But I also like to elevate census and voting around, okay? Because it's actually a system. Again, Stan already introduced me, but if you need my email, we could definitely connect following this with Stan. So like I said,
sorry to interrupt you real quick. So if you guys have questions, please don't hesitate to put them in the chat, and we will have a Q&A at the end. But if a question pops up in your head, just put it in the chat and we will get to it.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so like I said, I like to start with this framing. We know about the census. We'll talk a little bit about it. And why is because the census is literally the parent of redistricting. There is no redistricting and there is no potential to gerrymander. We'll talk about that later, but there is no redistricting without the census. A lot of folks don't frame it this way. There's a reason that we don't see this in the media. There's a reason that they don't tell us that there are steps to our voting, and they only engage us like you see all these political campaign ads that we were discussing before starting tonight. They're only engaging in this hot political season, even though North Carolina has elections every year. And so the census gives birth to redistricting using the data, right? The population count. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Then there's redistricting, and then redistricting literally gives birth to voting. There is no voting without redistricting, and there is no redistricting without the census. If we can get those three as a unit, then we will see why so many times we are disenfranchised or our communities are sorely impacted by voter theft, like Congressional District 9, when they had their ballots harvested. We'll see why there's polling hours that are so late, or why there is lack of diversity. Sometimes it's often on our Board of Elections, right? It all goes back to this three-step process. So I'm gonna start here really briefly and then move into redistricting, okay? Because the census is happening this year, and like I already said, the census births redistricting. Census is this year, Redistricting will be next year. That's the point, okay? So census, I call it recent history, even though it says 1790 on my slide, because my fourth great grandparent back was a part of this enslavement, and so it's recent to me. And so in 1790, the Black Americans were counting in the census for the purposes of counting their bodies, counting our bodies. We couldn't vote because we were enslaved, right? But they still used our literal physical count to give political power to white plantation owners. That's why when we hear, oh, George Washington enslaved people, oh, Thomas Jefferson enslaved people, it's not coincidence that elected officials also had people. It was actually political power, the more people that they enslaved. It's crazy, right? So they were counted as slaves and held no political power, enslaved people. Today, how do we see these same systems? In 2019, there was a citizenship question that hit the media. As Stan said, I was formerly with an organization called Friends of the Earth, and in my office there, we were a part of this massive movement to call on the Oversight Committee, right, in Congress to say, you can't add a citizenship question that hasn't been vetted or tested on the impact on community. How do you know? How will this impact the Latinx? How will you know how the citizen question will impact Black immigrants, Black migrant communities? Okay, they had no question for us, and so we challenged, why would you add a citizenship question to challenge whether folks are from this country and there's no proof of impact? That's negligent. But they use the exact same reason of adding this question of counting people's bodies absent of their political power. Because if I can count you, but I can prove you're not from here, then you can't vote. But I can still use your body for political count. It's identical to the process built in 1790 and before. It's the same identical system, right? So impacts on vulnerable communities. Like I said, historically, African Americans were not counted as human. After the abolishment of slavery, Southern states instituted Black codes, right? I won't go into the depth of the Black codes, but the Black codes is what actually created the police system as we know it today, the current iteration, and what it has been as a school to prison pipeline, as war on drugs, as in this moment of 2020, calling on the abolishment or defunding or divestment, whatever terms that folks are using to describe what they're calling for reformation, right? That system, however, was created as an anger of Southern plantation owners and electeds, because remember, a lot of them were one and the same. As soon as 1865, we just celebrated Juneteenth, right, on June 19th. In 1865, at that point, it was still decreed that even though in 1863, slavery was abolished, 1865, it went into effect for the nation. As soon as slavery was abolished, literally the Southern courts in numerous states, including ours, passed Black codes. It made it illegal for our people who were just freed to literally be without a job. It was called Vagrancy Laws. You could get locked up for being unemployed. You could get locked up for assembling in more than 2 or 3 Black peers. Like if you were in a group of Black folks, that could be illegal. And the police were used to actually enforce the anger of white plantation owners, not protect Black bodies. This was all created at a system that still created census and redistricting. It all ties in. Okay, that's why I elevate this for folks to do deeper research. So we see now, how is what I'm saying about police accountability? How is what I'm saying matter with the census and redistricting? What about present day? Prison population uses the exact same counting methods that the census in 1790 used. Same. The same enforcement of the policing system to incarcerate folks upon emancipation and literally prison labor lease them back to the very plantation that they were just emancipated from is the exact same system of enforcement that is used to incarcerate our people at a higher disproportionate rate, right? It's the same system. So prison populations are counted the same way. Folks that are incarcerated, when we look at felonies, they cannot vote, but their bodies are still literally counted. in the prison that they are incarcerated in. Depends on your area, depends on your local municipality, depends on your state. But oftentimes their bodies, our bodies, are counted and used for political power for whoever is the elected official or candidate in that district. Same system, no difference. Okay. And so current administration attempts to add the citizenship question, and then we know that communities of color, Black communities, are already disproportionately undercounted. While it has been proven that white communities are overcounted. And we could talk about why are they overcounted. It can be everything from they have multiple homes or properties. And so because they have multiple addresses in different states, they are counted twice or 3 times over. So there are cases where white folks are literally counted because of these gaps. And we can say whether it's intentional or not. We're not debating that today, but we are saying the fact is our communities are undercounted while white communities are overcounted. So we're about to get into redistricting, something I want to elevate here, which is why the census is important as we go into redistricting. The census allocates money for the whole 10 years, right? You do the census every 10 years. Yes, there's other little version and forms of the census. We're not talking about that today, but the actual federally required census is every 10 years. It moves funding for healthcare, housing, everything from SNAPs to welfare, to your schools, to your housing infrastructures, to even the paving on your streets. You know, when you're in a neighborhood, you're like, "Ooh, why is this road unpaved?" It's where you've ever been, especially country roads, right? Or urban areas. It's generally because funding was not allocated because they couldn't prove that a population lived there to justify the use of funding to pave that road. That comes from census. So these are just some examples. When we talk about hurricanes, because I'm huge on environmental, that's my background. You're talking about emergency mapping, FEMA, that comes from census population. That's how they get to folks fast, right? How much time does it take you to get to this person in an emergency response, be it a climate disaster or calling an ambulance, EMT. That response time is based on whether they know you live there and they allocate the appropriate resources to map you, to see where you are, and to get to you. This is all in the census. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. So how does it connect? Because we're going into redistricting, right? Remember, census, once communities are counted, these numbers are used to create, let's go to redistricting, our voting districts. We vote every local, county, state, and congressional election in these districts. Let's go up to the top for a moment. The census data is used in apportionment. How many elected representatives your state can have in the US House? Your voting districts all come from the data in the census. And then finally, these two, right, they are combined to create your voting districts, your precincts, your polling places. That is all determined by your districts, which is why what Stan mentioned about A&T is extremely important. Extremely important that students are now split in half. This campus is split in half. Where are their polling places? Why are they voting for 2 different Congress people when they have the same needs? That was a huge thing a couple of years ago when it was very first gerrymandered, is what we call it. And we'll talk about that in a moment. I was one of the first trainers that trained the SGA students at the time, SGA members, of how to actually read their maps. And they were the students who engaged in the litigation following that with other advocates and attorneys, and did a documentary, AJ, because they were trained on how to identify it. And they have been embroiled in this fight. It's incredible. Okay. So redistricting. So when we look at redistricting, what is redistricting? Here we are, right? Redistricting is the action, I've already said it, of creating political maps, your local, your state, your federal, it's your political areas, right? When you go online, you're like, okay, where's my polling place? Where am I gonna go vote? That was created by redistricting because they used your population numbers when you filled out your census to say, okay, 5 people live in this neighborhood, 10 people live in this neighborhood, therefore they need a polling place that's between them. That's the data that's used, and redistricting is actually supposed to be a good thing. It's legally required. So every 10 years that you have the census, it's followed by redistricting. It's required. Redistricting is the good side, or supposed to be, right? It's the process. Once we have our political representatives that we voted for, they are then placed into these districts. That's why, you know, when you hear, oh, this person has to live in this district to run for this office, it's because they are redistricted there. So why should we care? You know, I've already kind of laid that claim. It affects where we vote, who we get to vote for, and it affects every single person living in the state, whether they choose to exercise their right to vote or not. So for North Carolina, let's really talk about this, right? Redistricting, how's it done? Every state is different, okay? But here's a trend, and we're gonna see it. School board members draw school board districts. City council draws city council districts. County commissioners draw county commissioner lines. And state legislator draw state house, senate districts, and congressional district lines. Do we see a trend there? Stan, what do you see? What do you see a trend?
Sure.
Let me break it down a little bit. So the school board gets to draw its own voting districts. The city council is responsible for drawing its own voting districts. Some folks are like, well, should the folks who are running for election or re-election, should they be in charge of drawing their own voting maps?
So I have a quick case in point with that. So in Fort Myers, so I lived in Fort Myers, Florida, for 2 years. Don't move to Fort Myers, Florida. But one of the things I noticed in Fort Myers was there was no person of color on the school board. Now, in what urban area do you not find a person of color on the school board of all places? And so this is why, you know, it gets into why certain schools look better than other schools, why certain schools have more resources than other schools, and so on and so on and so on.
Right. And we had a report a few years ago about the fact that, you know, our busing system, even here in North Carolina and Wake County more specifically, is the most segregated it has been in years since, you know, I think ever. And so here's the thing. We see the negative, right? We see the negative, you know, repercussions to having folks who are in office responsible for drawing their own districts that they are potentially going to run for re-election in, right? We see that that's kind of a setup. But it was actually supposed to be, at least it was intended in policy, it was supposed to be that way because who else would know your school districts than your school board? That's why we're trusting elected officials and saying, okay, I choose you as the community, I choose you, elected official, to run and represent me because you have us and our best interests at heart. So I trust you to read these maps. I trust you to create a fair busing system, to not segregate us or give us better, you know, Wi-Fi coverage in the middle of a pandemic because you're actually working with local cell providers to do so. Like, I trust you to do that for all schools. But when that trust is manipulated, we see the ill intent when folks are taking this power and drawing maps to keep segregation, right? And to keep themselves in power. But this is North Carolina. These are our rules, okay? In order to create justice, we must first recognize injustice. Just a quote of mine that I live by. Introduction to gerrymandering. So we hear gerrymandering, okay? That's why I started with redistricting, because redistricting, that word, that's legal. It has to happen every 10 years. It's by federal law. Everybody has to do it. The states have to do it. That's how we figure out who's running for office. That's how we know, like I said, where your polling places are. But how I mentioned, what Stan elevated, what happens when folks use this power, manipulate it to keep themselves in power, that is when it becomes gerrymandering. This is the evil twin of redistricting. That's what it is. So I have some pictures of gerrymandering districts. So you see this one on the right. This was the first ever gerrymander. It was named after a governor in Massachusetts called Governor, I think, Elbridge Gerrymander. And as a joke in the press, where we talk about media, they turned it to gerrymandering. I guess that's all the entertainment they had at the time.
Yeah, pretty much.
But look at the fact that this really old map, back in the 1700s, literally looks very eerily similar to North Carolina's gerrymandered map that was within the last 10 years. Okay, we're going to talk about why this is bad. So as I already said, gerrymandering is the act of drawing the same district lines, but it's with the evil intent, the dark intent to give your party more power than the other. That's why folks haven't been able, and, you know, I'm going to be very frank, I have my C3 hat on, so I'm going to be very, very, you know, careful. But that's why we as a community, as a state, even though we have more registered independents and Democrats, it has been Republican represented, is literally because of gerrymandering has protected them from being voted out. Okay, gerrymandering can be used because remember I said redistricting gives birth to voting. So if you mess with redistricting, you mess with voting. It's automatic. It's how you manipulate it. So gerrymandering is to give that party more power. Manipulation of drawing lines to change, maintain, or move power, and both parties have been guilty. This has been a tag back and forth, you're it, for years. It's just this time around, we see who has kept the power the longest, right? But both parties have been guilty. If gerrymandering is involved, what'd you say?
No, I was going to say, like, so for example, in North Carolina, the House and Senate are Republican led. And so when they came to power and started gerrymandering, they say, well, the Democrats did it to us, we're going to do it to them.
Right.
And it's just a cycle that just doesn't stop.
Exactly. And so when you have gerrymandering and your redistricting process is corrupted and it's turned into gerrymandering, the reality is voters lose out. It's us who lose that. It's us because it has taken our votes and it's predetermined who wins. It rigs the game. There was even a case where in North Carolina has similar cases, but just to go outside to just say, you know, other states are guilty, kind of make us feel a little bit better about it. Because, you know, North Carolina's been in the hot seat for a while. In New York with Congressman Hakeem Jeffries, when he was very first running for office prior to running for Congress, he went up against a fellow Democrat, went up, an incumbent. And so this incumbent, because he had the power to draw the maps, he literally drew a little squiggly line and cut out Congressman Jeffries' house, kept the entire district intact and drew a line and carved out his house. And only at the polls did supporters find out that Hakeem Jeffries was no longer on the ballot, because you don't have to get forewarning because it's in the power. So that's examples of gerrymandering. Here's the thing though, gerrymandering is only illegal when it directly discriminates against areas based on race. So it's not illegal to gerrymander parties. It's crazy. It's only illegal if it discriminates against race. And that's because of the Voting Rights Act. It's because of the labor of our ancestors and our elders, because that was not that long ago, but I want to give honor to both, okay? Because of their labor, their sacrifices, that is why gerrymandering is illegal. Other than that, it's free game because both parties are guilty. So here's an example of an old map. This references what Stan elevated about A and T, right? So this is the old gerrymanders. I hate calling it old because this is like a whole 3.5, 4 years ago. And 2020 has felt like a whole decade by itself, but I don't consider 3 or 4 years ago old. So I say that very loosely. But this right here, as I showed you before, that picture of gerrymanders where it looked like animals and like it literally looked like dragons, we see these shapes. And when you redistrict, it is not supported or optimal to choose shapes that look jagged. You want to have shapes that have more of a round or like a definite, pretty kind of edge, border, circle, rectangle. This jaggedness, we could tell it's cutting people out. It looks like someone who couldn't color in the lines. Okay. So let's look at this district right here, this little squiggly line. And this is the old District 12, Congresswoman Alma Adams district. And so what they did to Congresswoman Adams' district was they packed over half of our state's total HBCUs in this one district.
All so I-85.
Think about it. Exactly. If you know that area, you know what they did. And so here's the thing. Because we know that oftentimes political party is almost a mirror image of ethnicity and race, it's easier to target Black communities because we oftentimes register as Democrats. So the Republicans, or we saw this choice to draw this because they could say, oh, we didn't discriminate, we just followed party lines, right? So that's how we got around the nuance of saying, it wasn't intentional to pack over the HBCUs, they just happen to be Democrat. Think about that. But of course, they were caught on camera. Folks were caught on camera, electeds, and I can't say their name here, please look it up, literally said that they targeted African Americans with surgical precision. Remember when I said they're like cutouts? Surgical precision. They took software and they drew these gerrymanders deliberately. It's computers. You don't have to draw redistricting by hand. You don't have to do political districts. You don't need to count. We got technology. So if you're using technology and getting this, it's intentional. Okay. This map down here that looks a lot prettier, like I said, I'm not saying from a GIS mindset, like looking at this, that this is the best map to go with, but it is definitely more optimal, more, actually fair than the top. Now, this is old numbers, but I want to be very clear that when this map was drawn, this was our actual like registration in the state, okay? So Democrats 2.6, unaffiliate 2.0, 5.6, and Republicans 2.055. Last place, absolute last place. But let's look at what we saw, right? 2017, like I said, this is around that time. House 46, Republican Party 73. Now, wait a minute. You're in last place, but you have 73 seats? Wait a minute. Here we go. Senate 15 and 35. We saw the ill impact of those gerrymanders. More recently, as of February 2020, this year, we see, we took back some seats, which was great in the House, right? But we're still seeing a disproportionate amount, right? It just still doesn't look fair. Democrat Party 55, Republican still 64. Democrat 21, Republican Party 29. And if we look at the numbers, guess what? We had more unaffiliates register, and look at, yes, the gap widens. Yet we are not closing in on who actually wins. That is your proof, your data, aside from reading the maps, that something just isn't right here. And it seems like the votes are predetermined. So I want to make sure, because I know I'm just going to do a couple more slides and I'll pause there because I want to make sure that we're, answering questions, Stan, or maybe let's check to see if there's questions so far. Let's do that.
So there is. So one person asked, when you talked about the census earlier, and if say like a white person has like multiple properties, that they're counted those multiple times. The question is, doesn't that apply if a Black person has multiple properties in multiple places? Doesn't it go both ways?
It does go both ways, but as far as like the data of wealth and income, think about socioeconomic prosperity. So when we compare the percentage rates of, like, we know that it is quoted that Black Americans make up 12.9% of the total population, and we look at the majority population is white Americans, number one. Number two, socioeconomic and median income, what that's based on is how many folks actually own double amount of homes. Not that it doesn't happen for Black Americans as well, but you have a larger amount of white Americans that own more properties, therefore they're going to get counted more so. So now that it doesn't happen, but you're looking at just data, who is counted more based on how much more they own.
Right.
So I hope that helps.
One more question, and I feel like you're going to get to this actually. What is the status of redistricting / gerrymandering in North Carolina, and how do we reverse what has been done?
So that is ongoing, and I definitely will get into that, right? At this point, reverse, like we have held over 10 elections since these gerrymanders were instituted. Right now, Congressional District 12 and these other districts that I showed you has been defeated through litigation, and many organizations and attorneys really fighting. My office was a part of, signing in support of some of these Supreme Court cases and actually signing on an amicus briefs. Like, we have been a part of that fight, but being a part of that fight meant that elections still happened while we were fighting. So how many years, like I said, over 10 elections, how many years, how many elections has created such a deficit in communities, and how do we really reverse that deficit when elections kept proceeding? And so that is food for thought, and I don't really have an answer of how you reverse just a systemic impact. Where we are now is, what is fair redistricting, and how do we demand it really clearly in policy? That's why it's important what Stan was saying, that we are clear with our communities that it exists. Most communities don't know redistricting exists. How can we fight a system when most of our folks don't know what it is? And so we're having to really start, at the same time of doing litigation, a holistic approach so that communities place extreme pressure on their elected officials, or they endorse from county tables, or they choose who they want to run because they have this vision of what fair redistricting looks like for their community. But unless the community knows what fair redistricting is for them, they can't demand it. And we'll see this repeated. So what'd you say?
Also, Matt, not only that, but also it goes back to having a unified meaning, a unified definition. I mean, with redistricting and gerrymandering, those things are very clear cut. But like we were saying earlier about defunding the police, you ask 5 different people, they will probably get 5 different answers as to what they think defunding the police is. And so it's part informing the community, but it's also informing the community around a defined definition of what it is.
Right. And something I do want to elevate, and then we can take one more question and I'll keep going a little bit longer, is back in the 90s, really before then, but there's an organization called Southern Echo. I absolutely love this organization. They are a Black founded led organization in Mississippi, Jackson, Mississippi. And one of their original co-founders was actually an original member of SNCC. And so they trained in community in Mississippi in the 90s using the Voting Rights Act, right? Like what I was saying that our folks fought for in order for, gerrymandering to be illegal if it was done on basis of race. But they taught communities across the entire state how to actually draw their own maps. And they did, and they won. They literally doubled their African-American caucus in 1 year. It was crazy. And that's something I implore folks to look at, because this model has already been done. And that model that was created by Black Americans and did win in the 90s, that is the model that was used in California over 10 years ago. They actually use the exact same model. Every state that you're seeing that is winning these redistricting fights actually has used pieces or the whole of this model created by an African-American community and organization based in Jackson, Mississippi. So just want to elevate that history, because it is something that has been done and can be done, and other folks are using it. We need to restore, like what Stan was saying, back to a common definition, common terms, and restore back to what is really rightfully our process that we created to win using the Voting Rights Act.
So we got 2 more questions. First is, I've heard of independent boards that review and make decisions about redistricting. Do any of these exist in North Carolina? Are there any best practices, whether in-state or out-of-state?
Such great questions. So there is not an independent board or process like the California process I mentioned. They have something called the Citizens Commission, the California Citizens Commission. And so for the past couple of years, we actually had them come to the state and begin to talk to our elected officials about what it would look like to actually have an independent review board that either was comprised, which we hope, of citizens mixed with advocates and experts to create just accountability, right? And so that is something that we have been embroiled in for the past, I'd say, half decade, more, depending on organizations. Let's be very fair here. But as far as like where my path is, where my track is to answer for me, we have been a part of this for half a decade. And so we did, like I said, conversations. We did introduce a Senate bill called the Golden Standard in Redistricting in I think it was just 2019, the spring. I was about to say 2018, but spring of 2019. 2019, and one of our co-sponsors was Senator Erica Smith, who ran in Cal Cunningham's district, right? And so Senator Smith and Senator Foushee, who is the chairwoman of the North Carolina Black Alliance, were co-sponsors of this Golden Standard Redistricting bill. And it laid out the process of what a citizens commission could look like. But of course, we already know who's in office, and to vote for an independent board is to vote against your own best interest. So of course we don't have one, even though advocates are fighting every day, and some of our champions who are our elected champions, they're fighting, but you're trying to convince folks who have been in power through gerrymandering to relinquish that power and share it. And that's not an easy process. And as far as models to look at, definitely, you know, look at pieces like Southern Echo. Look at what they did originally. I implore you to look at the foundation of what they did, because every other model in every state is based off of, their version is based off of that Southern Echo model. So if you go to the foundation, then once you look at California, then once you look at Pennsylvania, when you look at Michigan and you see introductions of bills that they have introduced, right, with these boards, you'll start to see what works for North Carolina and what doesn't. And that would be my recommendation of who to look at. And the last thing on that piece is in Robeson County, in the same dispensation of time in the 90s, Southern Echo actually came to North Carolina and trained Robeson County how to win fair redistricting, and they won. A gentleman by the name of Mr. Angus Thompson, who was the first just rural public defender, because there's only one rural public defender in the state. He actually fought litigation while the community protested and advocated, and they won fair redistricting in the 90s, but that history has been buried. So I also implore you to look into their what they've won in the past.
And one more quick question. How often can a political party or office draw or redistrict an area?
So that's another great question. So remember, it happens every 10 years. So pay close attention to following the census, because after the census goes into using that data to redistrict. So it's supposed to only be once every 10 years, right? And then you track through census data the next 10 years population. That's the whole point. It's like if population moves in the state, you want to see, oh, we need more representatives in like the US House because you got a lot more people moved in. Okay, if your population decrease, then you don't need as many representatives, or it stays the same. So every 10 years is what it's supposed to be. But when courts, like what we did in supporting organizations who brought litigation, the courts require a mandate or say, hey, you're going to have to redraw these maps. We saw that in Charlotte. And then, of course, that happened within 5 or 6 years into the redistricting. So if the courts mandate it or require it, which is why your judicial races really matter, really, really matter. And Justice Cherie Beasley, just to elevate her awesomeness, not endorsing C3, not endorsing anyone, just elevating what she's done so far, it's very important to look very critically at these offices, because these judicial races determine whether you need to do over the redistricting, whether the elections need to be halted, and that can happen in the middle of the 10 years. Yeah. All right. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, he's really
We're getting questions for now. We'll have you pick up, and then we'll get back to some more questions.
Okay, cool. Appreciate the questions. So the impact. So like I said, I'm an environmental person, and so environmental justice person. That's my background, my history, my family lineage as well. And something that is very true and has remained true nationally as I have traveled to survey environmental impacts is that just like disenfranchisement, just like the process we've seen of discrimination, environmental impacts follow the exact same course. So the same chemicals that is dumped in Eastern North Carolina are the same chemicals dumped in Mississippi and Detroit, Michigan. So, so I follow. So I'm going to use this category as an example of impact. You can use it for criminal justice reform if that's your specialty, economic justice. So I'm just going to show you an example of how you can use your focus area to be hyper vigilant and focus in on how does redistricting impact what is your passion or the community need. So like I said, these are the old maps. I already showed this, but there's a reason I'm showing you this, okay? Up close a little bit, more magnified. We see all these jagged districts. I mentioned 12, but we also see the same thing in the east, right? Congressional District 9, that had 844 stolen ballots after the hurricane. This is your area down here, okay? So when we look at this area, right, something is gonna happen. So watch closely. Boom, y'all see that? Something just exploded on the map. Boom. What are all these points? So this is environmental language. CAFOs is hog farms, big industrial hog farms, poultry plants, but they're the big corporate, not local farmers. I come from a long line of agriculture, a long line of farmers. I'm not talking about your small mom and pop farms. I'm talking about industrial sized farms that have
Your
like
Smithfields,
800 plus.
for example.
What'd you say?
Like your Smithfields.
Exactly. Look, I feel like you're reading my mind. Exactly. And so these hog farms are displayed in purple. This is hog farms and poultry plants that are displayed in purple. And this concentrated area, like what Stan just mentioned, is Duplin and Sampson County, right? The number 1 and number 2 producers of hogs in the world, most definitely the nation, but it has been reported as the world. And we know the Duplin and Sampson is barely 10 minutes apart, if that, okay? And so what we're seeing is, here was the Atlantic Coast Pipeline, which by Sunday has been defeated. This is something folks worked on for years, and it was defeated on Sunday. But when this map was drawn, we were showing the impacts of this pipeline. This circle was a compressor station that was literally a blast zone in Northampton County that could explode at any minute, by the way. That's what it is, you know, safe maybe. Not really. We know that in Eastern North Carolina, it's over half of the population of the state, largest African-American population, largest Native American population, holds immense electoral power, right? These other points on the map are also liquefied natural gas, coal ash, all the things that go into your water in hurricanes, and they have. Now, here's the thing. Did you notice that these pollution sites fit the gerrymanders? Look at these green stars and how they literally go in a line up Charlotte's former congressional District 12. Do you see that? It's intriguing, isn't it? Look at how it is concentrated and covering the areas that are gerrymandered. So we found in this research, this was a project that I did with a GIS expert, and this was like something I really wanted to focus on when we were really supporting litigation, was proving that these environmental contamination zones matched the gerrymanders, and it turns out they did. And it turns out the same elected officials who gerrymandered themselves in also took over $200,000 in campaign donations from Smithfield and other such corporations. It wasn't an accident. We also found, and I can't say the bills, like I said, C3 had, but we also found that there were several bills created to protect the corporations and hurt local folks from filing lawsuits for public nuisance, smell, and other contaminants coming from the actual corporations that was causing cancer, lung and bronchial issues. We found out all of this because we matched the gerrymanders with the environmental impact zones, and they were almost identical. This is how you could take your map to see, is it food districts, food deserts, right? Food deserts, we know it's the lack of access to healthy foods, fresh fruits and veggies. It's said to be at least, you're at least a mile, minimum is a mile away, right, from the grocery store, but some folks live miles away in a rural area. You can use, and I won't go on these data, these stats, please study, you know, look at this at your leisure when you receive this information, because this has just the impact of food deserts. But look at this map. This is the U.S. Department of Agriculture's North Carolina Food Atlas, and they use the same census data to draw their maps to identify where food deserts are. And then the question is, do these food deserts match with your disenfranchised areas, your areas that don't have polling places, or at least as many as you should? Do these areas match you know, neighborhoods that need more than urgent cares? Hospitals are far away, DMVs are miles away, there isn't a busing system. These are the many questions you can ask yourself using redistricting. A couple more slides and I'm stopped for, you know, tonight with the slides. Urban heat islands. You know, mentioning rural areas, like I said, I'm a rural girl, but I have to give love to my urban areas as well. urban heat islands. We don't talk about these enough. People plus asphalt plus no green environment means the literal core temperature elevates, and it elevates the body temperature of the people who live there. So they have high blood pressure because it's hotter there. Hypertension because it's hotter there, not because it just happens to be genetic and solely a diet or reverse. It can literally be because the area you live in is a hot stove with the asphalt and it rose up. Why does this matter? Why does it matter that Black folks are 52% more likely than whites to live in these islands? Why does it matter that Blacks bear 56% and 63% more air pollution than they cause? Blacks and Hispanics, why is this important? Because your local maps literally draw where your busing, transportation, corridors, your 4 lanes, all that's redistricting. That's your local city council. That's your local zoning. It's not just voting the one-time big election year. Who you vote for will draw these maps with your Department of Transportation. And it may just elevate the core temperature of your neighborhood and cause high blood pressure in your elders, in yourselves, and in your future generations. This has to be zoned, and zoning is redistricting. I'm telling you, it impacts your all life. Like I said, Voting Rights Act, we'll stop there. I already spoke about that. 1965. I want y'all to study that later. But really, I've already shown this, and that's really where I'll pause. I want to end it on that slide. And so, like I said, census, redistricting, voting. All right, Sandra, do we have any other questions?
Oh yeah, we have questions, and please keep these questions coming. These are great questions, and this shows that people are paying attention. So
Right.
we greatly appreciate the questions. So the first one is, who draws the district maps for judicial races?
So when you're looking, so again, when you're looking at your, like we said with the congressional, and I'm sorry, did you say congressional or judicial?
Judicial.
Okay, so depending on, remember your legislators, right, your state legislators, and you need to look at which, you know, if you're looking at North Carolina, you need to look at exactly who your legislators are drawing. That impacts your judicial maps. That impacts, remember your office, those offices have direct contact, which means direct power with how those maps are drawn, but really key in on your senators and your representatives and really key in on those legislative races.
All right, and the next question is, so my area in Columbus, since I know where Victor is, Columbus, Ohio, due to gentrification, our non-members have indicated there is a need for more representation. Would this also then be an instance of gerrymandering? And how will we find out such if it's in between those in between the 10 years?
I may have to repeat a section of that so I'm not missing it, Stan. So just to back up just a little bit, can you reframe that? Is it gentrification that is in, is there trying to prove gentrification is impacted by redistricting? I just want to get the question.
So I think the question is, there are not enough Black and brown people in elected office. And so his question is this the result or one of many results from gerrymandering, where I know in North Carolina, yes, where you redraw the maps, you squeeze out your competition.
Yep. So gentrification most definitely is always connected to levels of gerrymandering, be it your political maps of gerrymandering, or like I said, there's transportation corridors. What I would say, and this goes into kind of part 2 of your question of like, how do we address this? How do we prove it? I encourage folks, visit your local counties, like local city website. They should have your zoning maps clearly published in their minutes and in their plan for the town. Those zoning maps that they're color coded, right? Those color codes and those lines, that's redistricting in that form. And it will tell you how you've been gentrified. It will literally say in those zoning maps, it'll say commercial district, only, 25,000 square feet and above is allowed. That means grocery stores, which are usually 20,000 and above square feet, they can operate. Then you say, okay, but are those grocery stores, is that commercial district, ain't that 3 miles from the Black neighborhood that's green, which means they can only have 1,000 square feet max? in their area, which means they can only legally have corner stores and convenience stations. Look at your local zoning maps. And then though that's like one of the beginning steps, but I do implore you to become familiar with how your town is zoned. And you can actually, depends on your local area. That's why I said, look at your local city. You can actually submit a form to your local elected leaders, right? Be it your city council or your county, like I said, hunt it down, see who is responsible for the zoning. You can submit that form and challenge and request and suggest a difference in how they are zoned. You can literally challenge it, but folks don't know to challenge it, so it goes unchallenged. And then you'll see the development of developers coming in. We already know gentrification, the whole story. So look there first. And then some other things. Look at competition clauses. And that's harder to find. But what that means is, like Walmart, I'm just going to use them as an example, and I'm not going to say this is what they've done, even though we kind of know they've done this. Walmart will, for example, they are in this part of the town, part of the city, and they have drawn a contract with whoever the city and the landlord is to say, if we move, you are legally bound by 10 years not to allow anyone with our similar business to move into this building. And they do that because they don't want competition. They're a monopoly. But that impacts the community because now they've moved Walmart Supercenter. They've blown up, and Walmart Supercenter is now 2 miles plus away from where they originally were. And that community is out of luck, but that building stays vacant because there's a competition clause that illegally prevents anyone from moving a business into that town. And then third, and I'll pause there, third is look at your local ordinances. Your local elected leaders, and this happened in Concord, North Carolina, as a literal response to racial uprising back during the Vietnam era. And so the local leaders used protest as a reason to pile on well over 80 different ordinances that limited any business, any grocery store from ever coming back in that town again. And it took them 30 plus years, well, 25 technically, to remove every ordinance. And the local NAACP helped them do this and other chapters, and they moved it. But even now they call it drought because the stigma, because it's like, well, why couldn't we come in? Business still won't come into town now that the ordinances have been removed. So look and see what ordinances, competition clauses, local zoning maps.
So the example you gave about zoning, the person who asked that question said that is exactly what happened. So yeah. Another question is, wasn't there a challenge to gerrymandering based on political party in North Carolina?
Yes, and it was historic. It was historic. And so let me put it this way. Like I said before, appreciate the question and just love how y'all are like into this. This is great. For the first time, North Carolina we were so awful and so embarrassing that the courts were like, okay, this has got to be illegal. This has got to be illegal. It was the first time in history that a state had done gerrymandering so egregious that the courts had no choice but to say, this isn't cool. And that's why it was such a huge deal in the press a few years ago, because North Carolina set the precedence for being that awful. But that created a historic moment at the same time that Pennsylvania was in their lawsuits, right? It created this momentum that we have seen continued that says, number one, party and race are closely connected. And number two, it was targeted to Black Americans with surgical precision. So how can you separate the two? And so you're looking at, yes. And so when we look at North Carolina, that was a rare and hopefully continued example of what happens when you combine activism, advocacy, and litigation.
So another question is, how can you fight a competition clause?
Right. So, so I am not an attorney who can speak on that. So what I'm going to say is this. I try to be very careful with giving legal advice. I tell people where to look, and that is such an excellent question, right? And so of course, I would implore when you're looking at the competition clauses, try to get your hands on the original documents, or at least, like when I say original, just get the details. You need to know what your years are, right? Is it a 5-year competition clause? Is it 10-year? Is it 20? Know your details of your policy. That's what's extremely important, because if you know the details, that's what you challenge, right? So if you're like, okay, in a capitalistic society, I can't necessarily possibly challenge you on the grounds that it's illegal for you to have a competition clause. But what I can challenge you on is depriving the community from fresh accessibility to fresh foods for this many years. So let's actually get these years in policy. Let's put a cap on it. So your competition is 2 years. Let's put a cap on it. And that's why I implore folks to work with an attorney that is specialized in that area, but look at the details of that contract if you can, if somebody could dig it up, right? Because it's the other part. Look at the details. How long? When was it started? Because it might already be expired and people just don't want to move in because there's been a stigma around it. Okay, so that's just some stuff, but I just want to implore folks, reach out to an attorney.
So another question. Gerrymandering is an issue. It reflects reasons to quote, take power, end quote, from quote, others, end quote. I believe this is fertile ground for change in our current environment. It's going to be tedious but attainable process day by day. Getting to the question. For those who may lack patience in the process, what do you recommend as a major factor to dig in and endure the resistance ahead? What trends, if possible, can you identify what shows in our current environment that there is hope for change?
Right. So with the first question, that is about, and I appreciate the community leaders, right? Whether you consider yourself that or not, you are a community leader just to be on this call tonight, because you have absorbed, whether it's information that you've already known and now you're just like sharpening your knife, so to speak, sharpening your tools, or it's completely new information. It is now deposited within you that when you have these conversations with your family, with your community, when you're organizing, no matter what that looks like with faith-based leaders, now that this is what I said and why I use the environmental justice piece. If you can infuse the concept of gerrymandering into daily tangible impact, then as soon as you talk to your community and they say to you, yeah, my biggest issue is segregated schools, then you're done. You already know what they'll listen to. You'll know that as soon as you talk about sprinkle some redistricting in there, well, honey, did you know that your buses are like that because that map, literally there's a map that was drawn that tells that bus not to stop by your house? Soon as you do that, it's like, what do you mean? That Southern Echo model that I referenced earlier was literally created on that model. They would go into community, and it is a marathon. It's not a sprint. I just have to say that for us as the leaders, it's a marathon. It's a slow walk. So there's no quick fixes. But the model was, they went and they said they were doing hearing sessions. You can listen, but are you hearing me? So they said hearing sessions, and they went through and they heard first what people felt the most passionate about. And they wrote down, okay, this community is about school. This community is about Medicaid. This school, and they tracked it, right? And I'm not gonna give too much of the process because I don't wanna mess up the details, but I'm giving an example, is if you track what is dear to your community, and y'all already know what's dear to your community because y'all are the community leaders, you have to sprinkle the redistricting and the gerrymandering in there to where folks are absorbing it, and they don't even know that you just spoke about gerrymandering. They think you're just talking about busing. They think you're just talking about Wi-Fi not reaching 100 feet past their children's school and COVID, and it could have just gone to their house instead of them having to drive in the parking lot of the school to do schoolwork in the car. They will not know that you deposited gerrymandering because this is a holistic approach, and that's my recommendation as a community organizer, how I've been able to do it. And I'm not saying I'm there's many different experts. I'm just saying from my experience, but you know your community better than I do. And so the second question, what do I see hope in? So in this moment, right? 2020 has been a lot, y'all. And I know folks on this call know, because we're living in this nation together in 2020, and it has been a lot, just to say the least. But Senate Bill 168, that's an example I'll use of what I see as the current climate. Senate Bill 168 was passed in the middle of the night 2 Fridays ago by our legislature. They voted on it, barely discussed the bill, and passed it almost unanimously. 1 vote no, okay? Turns out that bill had amazing relief money for our community, for North Carolina, that we needed, like actual support dollars. But hidden in that bill was a provision that said, that death investigation records could be completely concealed from the public for prisons, jails, and police custody. So we know some folks, when police are investigating or is being investigated, that's private. But as soon as the investigation goes to the chief medical examiner and they're examining the cause of death, that's when it becomes public. That's when we know, exactly how Sandra Bland died, right? Like, what was the cause of death? Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, so forth. That's how we know the cause. Michael Kirk, 2014, North Carolina, Alexander Correctional Facility, who died of thirst because they didn't give him water for 5 days straight. It was because of that public record that advocates could prove how they died. If this provision and this whole bill would have went into law, it meant that it could be remain private, period. That is a slap in the face for folks who've been talking about police reformation. That's a slap, right? We're seeing the consistent impact. But what gives me hope is there were protesters on the ground who literally slept in front of the governor's mansion. The Black community fed these protesters. We literally paid for food and food trucks, Black-owned food trucks, to go out and feed the community, gave them yoga mats, and looked into the policy of how to get porta potties out there. And while they were protesting outside the governor's mansion, we stayed up till 2 a.m., wrote an entire document of policy recommendations with criminal justice experts, and had it on the governor's desk by 8 a.m. the next morning. That same day, we planned a press conference virtually in 2 hours and had a petition with over 2,000 signatures. And Ice Cube even tweeted because he said North Carolina was embarrassing. And Governor Cooper responded with a press conference and said, yeah, I'm not liking this provision and it's not good. And it was vetoed yesterday. And it will go for a vote tomorrow for them to keep the relief money, to keep that support money, but to remove the provision because as a community, we had a system, advocates on the ground, advocates who were experts writing the policy recommendation, advocates who then pushed it with press conferences and petitions that circulated. And then we had outside support from a national person, Ice Cube in this instance. That whole trifecta, a week later, it was vetoed and we didn't lose the money. That's 2020. And it's been met with a lot of sorrow, a lot of depravity, a lot of hurt. COVID-19 is real. Environmental impacts make COVID-19 much worse for our communities because what I said before, how we live around more environmental pollution sources than any other race. That's why COVID is that much worse for us. But in the midst of all of this, when I see that, if we could keep that momentum, and it is hard, it's a marathon, and we have to train other folks to keep it going. When I'm tired, who am I going to pass the baton to so I can rest? That's the other part. What is my lane? We even have a protest music concert coming up. This will be virtual, where literal local artists have recorded music to match the movement. And in the music is policy recommendations. Stuff we haven't done before, where folks are getting out and you could feel the energy, you could feel the spirit, you could see it, and it's happening, right? You could see it, you could feel it. It is hopeful for me because I've seen it here lately, but the minute we get tired, the minute we're not training one another how to do the marathon, and the minute we're not training folks to tap in when we needed rest, we're going to lose that momentum. Because as you can see with the gerrymanders, the adversaries, the opponents, they don't rest. So we have to learn how we have to be so that we could be sustainable, so we could stay on them the way they have stayed on oppressing our communities.
So with this question, and I believe you hit on this earlier, just other than voting people in and out, what other tools and tactics can communities do to protect? I don't know if it's to protect against, the question is protect against gerrymandering, which since both parties do it, I don't know if you can, but I guess as you were alluding to earlier, how to make it more fair for everyone. Right.
So, we at Black Alliance support the development of county tables, and that could be something we could talk about in, another session. However, if folks want to explore more, there's more information, love to share as much as I can. And those county tables support the training and development of community leaders, community folks who come together, and they actually make decisions because they know their community. And ain't on us. We support them, but ain't our business. We're not in it. We just say, here's how you do it. and then we out. But they literally will endorse candidates from the community. We at this point, elected officials, because the way it has been designed, think about 1790. If it was always absent of our voice, then we were never given the opportunity in that moment to voice our concerns. It didn't matter. So our perception of an elected official is they're on a throne. They're elevated. They're above us. That's just the systematic impact. That's the narrative. But the reality is they are public servants. So are we choosing them, or are they choosing to run? So what's our community approach of endorsing a candidate? Do you have approach? Do you have a list of, like, if you talk to your community, like I was saying, like, what's your needs? And you know that this county, this city rather, is, and it can be county or city, but this city, they are about school districts and desegregating the busing. They are about clean water and fresh food, more grocery stores. If that's their three issues, is your candidate running on those three issues, and do they have a viable plan? And on top of that, who would you choose to run that would know your issues? Have you trained a person in your community to say, okay, here's your three issues, honey. This is what we care about. This is what you need to do to rectify these three issues. We don't want you just talking about desegregating buses. We need you to know how to draw a map. Do you know how to draw a map? Okay, we'll show you. Those are the process of how you train your community leaders holistically, so that they are literally the mirror image of the community, and they know that's where their votes come from. And we could do that on a local level because we can place pressure on these down ballot races. It is possible, it is happening, it has happened, but it's those pieces where you are choosing who runs, you're training them, which is why you chose them, and then you stay on them. You have an appointed committee, whether it be the county table, and they stay on them, honey. They, look, I call you because something you did causes me concern. You haven't written this provision. What is this ordinance? What's going on? Because that representative, even when they get to the North Carolina Senate or House of Representatives, they technically are supposed to be writing bills that reflect what you asked for. But have we ever been asked what bills we want passed?
No.
It isn't phrased that way. It's like, oh, we trust them to do bills. Well, actually, they're supposed to come confer with you and say, okay, I need to talk to my people. What needs to change for this district? Oh, this is what needs to change. Those are accountability pieces. The other piece of gerrymandering and redistricting is legal. That system isn't going to change as long as we have census, redistricting, the whole system of America. Like, that piece isn't going to, it can't. I mean, it can, but that's anarchy. But so redistricting is here to stay, right? Period. Gerrymandering, however, goes back to, are you voting in between years? Are you being counted in the census to get the money and the representation you need? Are you choosing your local elected officials and your local leaders? Are you training them and then staying on them as a community and showing that without you, they will never win? And if you do that, those are just some steps that they have to draw the maps based on your community pressure. And that's just some, that's not all, but at least that's some feedback.
So this is I believe this is I have a question, well, two questions and a statement. And so the first question is, will the slide deck be available at the presentation? Yes. So hopefully before the end of this week, the slide deck will be on triangleiotas.org/time to build. And while I'm mentioning that, let me do a quick little plug about our next workshop. And our next conversation is actually very timely on electoral college, is what really decides who becomes president. Did you know that? Did you know that the way it's written, the popular vote does not decide who becomes president? Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016. Donald Trump won the electoral college, and that's why he's in office. So we will delve deep into that. And that workshop is on Wednesday, July 15th at 7 p.m. We will have a sign-up link on triangleiotas.org/time to build soon. So again, it's not voting just to vote. What does your vote mean? This is a part of that conversation. And so the second part of his question is, can we push our elected officials to fight this, or is it too much opportunity for both parties?
So, that is, I think, a question that a lot of us ponder. Like I said, advocates have been pushing to have these conversations. Right now, there is an actual redistricting school that some community folks are attending. And I think that's the beautiful thing. The more people who say that I'm interested in learning how to draw maps and I'm interested in learning my local redistricting process, the more that there are networks that folks can be plugged into. Like I could, with Stan, we could actually make sure that you're introduced to folks who will show you how to draw the maps so that you are your own local advocates. Like we actually have folks that we're paying, like local just citizens who are learning how to draw their own districts based on where they live, and then they will teach their fellow community members, and they will also go to the General Assembly or local elected leaders and say, hey, by the way, we drew this map, let's talk about it. And so there are opportunities to connect folks who are interested in this because it is ongoing. And the more folks we have, that's the other thing. Power is in numbers. If you have a person who is talking about District 1 and they live in District 7, District 1's representative isn't going to listen because your vote means nothing to them. Even if gerrymander dilutes your vote, some of your votes, and I hate to say it, all votes matter, all votes count. I say that. But I do say that all of your votes, they're diluted, but of course they still hold power even when you're gerrymandered, when I say diluted in the gerrymandering sense. So they're not going to care about your voice if you're advocating for a district they don't live in. So that's why it's important to have so many of our people and our like-minded folks in the area that they're advocating for. Know your policy. I say this, and will continue to say this. Policy, policy, policy. Policy can mean many things. It can be regulatory language. It can be bills. It could be ordinances. Policy is a big umbrella. And when we're talking about zoning, we look at ordinances. But if we thought we were going to look at a legislation bill, which, you can in some instances, you would miss who's hurting you how. So policy is key when breaking down how to place pressure on your elected officials, because then you're speaking their language. Stan, can you hear us? Okay. So
my AirPods died just as you finished talking, and I was switching the sound from the AirPods to the computer. So sorry.
Yeah, I kind of saw that anyway.
Yeah. Try to do that not too well. So lastly, and this is from Victor Peoples. Victor is the fraternity's director of health and service initiatives, and so he just wanted to thank you for taking the time to do a very excellent and informative presentation. One of his good friends is Lisa Whittington here in Columbus. I don't know if there's a connection. And also, he said for the brothers that are on this call, on this chat, this counts as community service. So log your community service hours. So that is from
Thank you, Victor. And you never know, because I actually don't meet that many Whittingtons. That's my maiden name, and I don't meet that many Whittingtons. So 9 times out of 10, I have cousins in Columbus now.
I bet you do. I bet you do. So any closing thoughts?
Just really appreciate, just want to say again, really appreciate the activism and just the service that you all do in community. I definitely gave a shout out to, our host here, Triangle Iotas, and definitely Sigma Gamma Rho, but also saw Alpha Phi Alpha and other folks. I definitely want to give just recognition and honor to the folks who have joined tonight. And that's definitely huge. And why is because even, judicial races are important this year, and census. And right now, this US Senate is literally trying to sneak in judicial nominees while we are in the midst of protest. So we cannot be distracted, because if they get these nominees in without any pushback or any challenge, those judges have either extremely long terms or lifetime appointments, and they will dictate everything from child support laws all the way down to your civil, criminal, all the things. They literally dictate your entire life. And if we are really being very consistent, which I believe this movement is here to stay. It has been. Like, this is North Carolina is built on movement. Let's talk about that. What we're going to see is, if we are really for real about criminal justice reform and police accountability, we cannot do that without our judges. When we saw what Anita Earls did, right? Justice Anita Earls, the fact that she knew redistricting because she was a redistricting expert leading all these cases, she was able to see these gerrymanders and say, not today. And she stopped it. That is why these races are important this year. And 2021, we should not call them between years. We vote every single year. And that's the other thing, is how do we get in the mindset of training our people in shifts? Like I said, take breaks, but we have to train our folks to know that next year is still going to be local, municipal races that will literally impact your everyday life, from stoplights to everything. Gentrification, housing bonds, your park bonds, all of that is next year. So I just appreciate y'all. Thank you, Stan. Appreciate this conversation.
So La'Meshia, on behalf of the Trying Iotas, on behalf of everybody who took time to be on this conversation tonight, thank you. Thank you to you. Thank you to everyone who took the time to be here tonight. And again, a recording of tonight's conversation will be on tryingleiotas.org /time to build, hopefully before the end of this week. That's the goal. And I will let everybody get back to their evening. So thank you, everyone, and have a good night. And if you haven't done the census, do the census.
It's online. It's online.
Yeah, do the census. And if you've done the census, thank you. Awesome. But now talk to your relatives, your friends. I know there's alphas on this call. Ask your frat brothers. Have you done the census? To my frat brothers, have you guys done the census? And so, as you can see, gerrymandering is not just one piece. It's multiple pieces coming together, and the census is what really kicks it all off.
And I want to say that there's always funding that is happening to support your community projects. One group that does a phenomenal job is NC Counts Coalition. It is a literal powerhouse. The executive director, Stacey Carless, is a powerhouse of a Black woman and has an amazing staff. NC Counts Coalition, be connected with them, and they can give you up-to-date census information, but also keep you in touch with up-to-date census funding that can support your community outreach if that's how you see fit to use, but definitely to help with outreach. But I do want to elevate that there is funding that consistently happens.
Awesome. So thank you, everybody. Have a great evening, and we'll see you guys, next week? 2 weeks?
I think next week.
Next week.
All right.
So thank you, everybody. Have a good night.